To work in a library has always been deemed a dull or boring job, so it may surprise you that staff at the British Library are now being offered emotional support to help them cope with workplace trauma. It includes putting trigger warnings on library books deemed insensitive, outdated or controversial. So to get to the bottom of what all this is about, I'm joined by author and academic Joanna Williams. Joanna, thanks so much for joining me. Can I ask you, this is about a document that the British Library has produced. Well, they produced it last year, they've just published it this week. Can you tell us what this document is and what it tells us?
So this is an anti-racist action plan that the library wants to implement, and it basically involves allowing the public to engage in safe searching of the library database. So rather than inadvertently stumbling across any content that you might find offensive, workers at the British Library, the librarians, are going to be employed to flag up any content that might be considered outdated or racist, or just to express attitudes and beliefs that we don't really are not seen as socially acceptable nowadays, let's say, old-fashioned views.
Now, Joanna,
and,
I think a lot of people...
if you spend all you...
A lot of people watching will see the flaw in this, that the British Library is one of the major copyright libraries. It has a copy of every book that is published going back many, many, many centuries, right back to the Magna Carta. And people used to have different attitudes, didn't they?
Absolutely. I mean, this is the most ridiculous suggestion, because where do you start? I mean, the Bible, you wouldn't have anything from the Bible. Nothing from the Old Testament would be allowed to pass through. You could take all the ancient Greek texts. None of those would be able to stand. You know, none of this works at all. Everything is going to have a warning attached to it eventually.
So what is their plan? They're going to attach warnings to all of these various books so that people who are browsing, shall we say, aren't traumatised. Of course, when you go to the British Library, you're not really browsing, are you? You know what you're looking for. But this, well, obviously it's a waste of money, there's that. But also they don't seem very good at their job, because, I mean, last year they applied some kind of warning to Ted Hughes, claiming he was descended from slave owners, and it didn't even turn out to be true.
No, absolutely. So I guess the person who would have a claim to be traumatized in all of that would be the relatives of Ted Hughes, who've discovered this bogus news about their now distant relative. So, yeah, the whole thing. But I mean, it's partly it's a waste of time and money. It's offensive to readers. It's insulting to the public that we shouldn't be allowed to make up our own minds about what it is we're reading. But I also do think it's a horrible job to get somebody to do. You know, people are being paid to spend their entire time looking for things to be aggrieved about, to seek out offence. And then extra people are then having to be paid on top of that to offer those people emotional support. I mean, where does that stop? Are you then going to kind of pay for another layer of people to provide emotional support to the emotional support workers? You know, so, this is the logic of this.
Joanna, where does all this come from? I mean, you've written previously a lot about trigger warnings. Where does this trigger warning idea come from, and why is it spread so rapidly through all aspects of society?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think originally it comes from the online world. I mean, people also trace it to things like the cinema, where we've always had age, or for a long time had age ratings on cinema. But I think that's actually something quite different, because it was never to do with offensive content per se. It was to do with sex or violence. That was much more specific, and it was much more about age rather than warning about things you might find offensive. From there, it moved into academia, where it is still so rife. Even just in the news today, it's talking about Exeter University, the Arts and Humanities faculty at Exeter University, giving trigger warnings associated with youth and age. I mean, you know, every person alive has been young at some point and will be old at some point. So quite why youth and age need to have trigger warnings, I mean, truly beggars belief. But it's from academia, where people have become accustomed to it, that I guess people have then gone out into work upon graduation and carried this idea with them.
And it's a real problem, isn't it? It points to an issue of infantilisation of students. You know, it's to suggest that students need to be warned about any possible thing that might upset them. I think one university put a warning on Ernest Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea, saying it contained scenes of graphic fishing. But I would have thought that students can cope with this kind of thing. Otherwise, why are they at university?
Absolutely. I mean, a good name for trigger warnings, I think, in that context is plot spoiler. Often you'll find kind of Anna Karenina trigger warning suicide. Well, shucks, what's the point of reading this book now? You've kind of given away major chunks of the ending. It's infantilizing, it's insulting, but it comes from this kind of culture of safetyism, where people are perceived as being so emotionally vulnerable to every aspect of society that they need these warnings to kind of wrap them up in cotton wool before they even read books. But I think there's that side of it, but it's also incredibly political as well, and we can't get away from that fact. There's other libraries. I've been speaking to a librarian from the University of Leeds who's been involved in putting trigger warnings on an archive. He's been helping to, he's not, but he compiled the archive. Other people are now applying the trigger warnings. He's very cross about this. And he was saying to me just how selective this process is, where the kind of butchering of animals, of livestock, is given trigger warnings, but murder, witchcraft, the occult is not. Do something to humans, that's considered perfectly fine, no need for a trigger warning. Kill a pig or a sheep, you must flag this up. And it's just reflecting the interests, if you like, of the people who are slapping on the warnings.
And can I ask where this leads? Because we had in the news today the story that the publishers of P.G. Wodehouse, Penguin Random House, are rewriting elements of his books because they think it might upset people. Is that the sort of logical development from this, that you're just going to get a bunch of sort of uptight Puritans going through works and changing them for us?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely where it leads. And it also seems to me to lead inevitably to censorship as well. I mean, if you're a university lecturer and you seriously believe these warnings, if you think that letting your students read this book is going to potentially traumatize them, then the very easy step is just not to include that book on the reading list in the first place. So it does seem to me to really be a precursor for censorship.
Do you think there is any pushback from academics and students? Because one of the things that troubles me a little bit is that no one seems to be complaining. I mean, if I were a student and someone was telling me, oh, you mustn't read this because you might get upset, I would tell them where to go.
Well, I would tell them where to go, but it would also make me want to seek out the books and to find exactly what it is that I've been told I shouldn't read. So I really hope there is a bit of that going on. I mean, certainly speaking from my own experience, I've been looking around secondhand shops, charity shops, for books with a great deal more enthusiasm than I ever used to in the past. I'm not interested in buying new copies of literature, and certainly not buying anything on a kind of e-reader anymore. I want the original kind of 1920s editions, of 1930s editions of Agatha Christie, the 1920s editions of P.G. Wodehouse. I want those original texts, and I really hope it does create a bit more of an appetite for people. This is my hope anyway, the kind of spirit of rebellion. We all go out there and read books published in the past 100 years.
Absolutely fascinating. Joanna Williams, thanks so much for joining me.